Hey everyone, and welcome to another week of Political Capital here on Check and Check Plus. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Joining me on the panel this week, we have Maclean K, editor of the Orca. Hello, Maclean. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Jillian Oliver, Green Strategist Extraordinaire, as always. Thank you, Jillian.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
Katie is off this week, so that gives us a chance to jump right into a bunch of different topics that we have. Disaster preparedness. I know we've talked about this on previous shows, and they're all on Check Plus, the free app, by the way, if you want to go listen to the kind of evolution of BC's disaster response questions. But it started with whether the government was too slow in telling people about the flooding risk that was about to happen. And the government's response has typically been, this is an unprecedented event, and it couldn't have foreseen it, and so it's done the best that it can. But this week, we had some criticism that threatened to kind of upend that narrative, and it comes from the Fraser Valley Regional District, which pointed out, at least in a couple cases, the government left them hanging when they asked for help. They wanted $1.5 million to shore up a road near Hope, which ended up washing away with the houses on it in the 5 days it took the province to respond. And they wanted some money for volunteer firefighters to pay them for working 10 days straight, which was rejected by the province. So I think the questions start here on, is this a real-life example of a failing of BC's emergency preparedness system? Is this just kind of what we might expect in a disaster when things are very fluid? What do we learn and kind of analyze from this? Maclean, why don't we start with you?
Well, it's obviously a failing. It's not a success. Even had the province responded in a day or so saying, "We are sorry, we don't have the resources," that would be an improvement over what happened, which was 5 days of silence. That is inconceivable in a crisis. Not paying volunteer firemen for 10 days is just, at a certain point, you have to. We're going to reach a point, I think, with the flood response where the only reasonable thing to say will be, we do need to review our emergency and disaster response system because clearly something is getting stuck along the way. And I don't know what it is. That's the point of a review. It's not to point fingers or to, claim any political victories or losses. It's just, we clearly need to do better. And because, as everyone agrees, there will be more of these ahead of us.
The problem seems to be, Jillian, and we've talked about it in the past, is the way the system works is local governments get asked to do this first, respond first, dispatch their crews, ask for help if they need it, because they know their communities best. And we know from that a lot of mayors want to keep that power. They don't want to hand it over to the faceless, nameless bureaucracy that is Victoria. But at the same time, they need funding and they need help. And not all districts, not all, especially rural and remote areas, have access to the money required to do the things they need. So are we starting to see that tension point expand? And is this kind of the Fraser Valley thing? What do you think it does politically for the government?
Well, I think that the scale of the disaster is something that our system obviously was not set up to handle. But we've had lots of warnings that this has been coming, that scales of this disasters on this scale have been coming, and we didn't make the necessary changes to scale up our response in accordance. And I think, the minister said that the Fraser Valley Regional District doesn't need provincial approval for emergency funding, but what he left out is that it's not guaranteed that that kind of funding is going to be approved if they take action that they need to take. So I think that it's obvious that the emergency management legislation needs to be reviewed. I think that there is a role for the province to have a stronger role in coordinating responses to disasters of this scale. And then I think, politically, I think it really changes the way that the government thinks about all of the reports that we're starting to see trickle out. In the past, we get reports about inadequate dikes, inadequate flood response, all of these sorts of things, and they're sort of just shelved because nobody's really paying attention to them. They don't get a ton of coverage. And then now we're seeing after the fact that we did have all these warnings, we could have done something. So I think it sort of changes the risk calculus for the government when they get those reports, that, this isn't a 1 in 100 year thing anymore. This is going to be in the news cycle, every couple of months. So
Yeah, it's a great point. It's harder to stuff them into a drawer in a cabinet and not look at them if they know that the chances of this thing happening is real, and then they're going to be held accountable for stuffing that report somewhere where people can't find it. Maclean?
I think at a bare minimum, one of the things that appears to be a flaw in the system now is treating all municipal governments as the same. The Fraser Valley Regional District is a great example. It is tiny in terms of population and resources, but large in area. Treating them as the same as the city of Vancouver or even Abbotsford, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. They don't have the resources to deploy. And so treating them as, the same as Kennedy Stewart or Henry Braun saying, you have the authority and the resources and the knowledge and the expertise and the people power to respond before determining whether or not the province should step in, I guess. But for the larger, in terms of size, regional districts that have very small populations and resources, it doesn't make sense.
Could we solve this thing with just money? I mean, the municipalities have asked for access to the carbon tax, Jillian. There's $2 billion in revenue that the government takes from the carbon tax. They want access to it. If they're going to be asked to locally respond first and prepare, they need the money to do it. If the government was to somehow open up a revenue stream for them and say, you're producing your own reports on, needing to repair a dike, and you're producing reports on emergency management, access this fund and do whatever you need to do. Does that solve it for the government, do you think?
I think that definitely could be part of the solution. I think, and we've talked about this on the show, local governments are often set up, because of populations, but disasters don't actually pay attention to sort of where those kind of municipal boundaries are. So, in the case of this disaster in particular, at a minimum, I think we need like a regional response. But I think there's also an argument for why the province needs to take a stronger coordination role, because there's so many overlapping jurisdictions. And in some cases, like we've talked about as well, there's, small regional district governments and these sorts of things in the more remote areas.
Yeah. Maclean, just ending with you on this one. The public safety minister has repeatedly said, Mike Farnworth, that he's going to review the Emergency Act and a bunch of other things in the spring. And that it seems like he's sort of backed into that a bit. It's come up at the beginning, and then more frequently he keeps saying it again and again. And I'm kind of wondering if expectations are building up there that we're expecting some sort of kind of review and overhaul of our emergency system, when in fact I'm not entirely sure BC is actually ready to do that. And so what is the political risk that government doesn't produce the kind of overhaul that we're all thinking they're going to produce in the spring before we have the wildfire season?
Well, and we're hoping that that doesn't get put to the test next year, and that we have a mild wildfire season, but that's just a hope. I think at a minimum, I hope the minister does do a review. I think this is probably the last cabinet in BC's history that doesn't have a dedicated minister of disaster response and emergency preparedness. There is a parliamentary secretary for emergency preparedness, but I have not seen hide nor hair of her during this crisis. I don't know if it would be her designated to perform a review. I think the argument has to be made that technically Mike Farnworth is the Minister for Public Safety, is spread very thin, and that's not a criticism of him. He is the House Leader. He is the Solicitor General. He's got a busy plate, a full plate rather. Having someone else whose sole responsibility is preparing and responding to what everyone agrees will be more emergencies in the future just seems like a rational step.
I guess the question will be whether it's a minister or whether they start building that into the mandate letters of all of the different ministries and go that route of saying you need to help the agriculture sector be prepared for a disaster in the agriculture mandate letter. I guess but you're right. I think we'll see that definitely in the budget of next year and especially in the spring as well. Let's move on to the next topic here about old growth trees. We've talked about this as well, but what happened in the last week is the big old growth plan from government to try and save 2.6 million hectares of old growth forests that were going to be deferred hit its deadline. Now, government came up with this deadline. They gave First Nations 30 days to take the maps they produced last month and decide whether they agree with them in each of their territories. That's more than 200 First Nations in 30 days and a very detailed data dump from the province. And predictably, I think, they refused to comply, many of them, with that. And instead, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs held a press conference this week with some legal experts and other chiefs saying that is an insulting timeline that the government gave them. It is not in meeting with the UNDRIP principles of free, prior, and informed consent, and many nations are just simply not going to follow this. So that has put the government in a weird position, Jillian. We'll start with you, of an old growth plan that was launched to a lot of fanfare, is not in place, has met a deadline that the government imposed, and now we have no idea how many First Nations have responded. We don't know what they've said. We don't know where government goes with this plan on its own. What do you make of where we're at?
Well, yeah, I think UBCIC made a good point, which is that the government took its own sweet time putting together this plan, beyond what their review called for. They called for deferrals within 6 months. And I think the government took like 18 or something like that to come out with this plan, and then demanded very swift turnaround from First Nations, whose, economies depend on this resource. So yeah, I think that it was obviously, I don't know what the government was thinking, if they thought that this was just kind of, they were stressing about the actions in Fairy Creek and all of the international attention that the issue was attracting, and they felt like they needed to get something out that showed that they were acting quickly. I'm not sure. That could be what was happening. But yeah, it's obviously not effective. We had One Nation come out saying that they accept 96% of the deferrals. However, the vast majority of those were not slated for logging in the next 2 years, or were already protected. So the plan has not yet seemed to have worked.
Mm-hmm. And staying with you, Jillian, like, what do you think government should do now? Because I get the impression from reading the statements from the minister that their response might be to give First Nations more time. Say that the flooding and the natural disasters have caused, a preoccupation with that, which is completely legitimate and fair. Maybe push it off to January or something like that. Does that solve the issue? Does adding a couple months give the government the time to make this work, or is it just on the wrong path at this point, do you think?
I think more time obviously is, what a lot of the First Nations are asking for, and I think that that's a good thing to give. However, I think that this really underscores why the government also needs to come to the table with resources. And I think, in light of what we're talking about with needing to shore up our resilience and our infrastructure in the face of climate change, I think we really need to start thinking about these forests, which, are incredibly productive at capturing carbon, are very productive in terms of biodiversity, are also important for preserving soil and preventing landslides and all of these things. We need to look at them as incredibly valuable natural infrastructure, and that they're not something just to be given away for free. And the government needs to come to the table with resources to preserve them if they want to keep them standing.
Mm-hmm. Maclean, what do you think?
I'm with Jillian in that I just absolutely am mystified that the government would have imposed a 30-day deadline in the first place. Even if we had just had the most boring and mundane 30 days pass, which I long for some dullness, but it was never an even remotely reasonable timeline for the amount of complexity here, for a fundamental shift in how an entire industry is managed. 30 days would have been unreasonable for the province, much less 206 Indigenous governments. It just they aren't inexperienced enough to have made that mistake, and so I am like genuinely perplexed as to why they would have done it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. It is a bit of an arbitrary. I mean, they've angered First Nations, who are the end goal of this entire forestry plan from government, is to turn over tenures to First Nations and have them lead the industry. And instead, they've ticked them off right from the beginning. Jillian, back to you just on one more thing here. You mentioned, and I think Maclean mentioned as well, there was a First Nation, the Hawaiian First Nation on the island, that came back with, yes, we agree with 96%, of the government's deferrals, but we want to log the remaining 4% because it's good for our economy and there's jobs, and they have a partnership in the Hawaiian with Western Forest Products, a company that they run together. So if the government does somehow miraculously get 200 nations to reply, and if many of those replies are, we agree with some but not all, and if that puts government in a position of having to allow the logging of a certain percentage of the 2.6 million of rare and ancient growth that it set aside, is that a politically good outcome for the government to allow that to happen? Or what kind of position do they then find themselves stuck in between First Nations responses all over the place, between wanting a moratorium, wanting to log, wanting somewhere in between?
I think that they are probably hoping that it does give them some political cover, that they can say, they're prioritizing reconciliation and jobs over conserving old growth forests. But, I think I go back to the same point that I already made. I think that they have to answer why they're not coming to the table with resources if the Hawaiian was very clear that it's for economic reasons that they are going to continue to log that remaining, I think it's about 650 hectares of old growth. So I don't think it makes the issue go away for them completely.
And the Hawaiian were saying, I talked to their chief counselor, Robert Dennis, who was saying, like, we have the resources to do this, to meet the deadline because we are involved in forestry, but even they want it until January. Imagine smaller First Nations who have no clue of the economic impact of agreeing to these deferrals on trees they don't even know they maybe even have or what their value is. So they've really kind of jammed the First Nations on this. But I'm interested to see how it plays out, because there's this extraordinary pressure on government to preserve the old growth from one wing, and then now they've got the First Nations saying you can give us enough time on the other wing, and how do those two things meet? So we will watch that. Moving on to the last topic here of the show, the freedom of information fight. And we have talked about this as well in the previous shows, but what is interesting about this file now is that, just a quick recap here, we had an FOI bill before the House. It did a bunch of different things, including allowing government to store your data internationally so that different health authorities and schools can access Zoom and cloud services like Google Classroom. That part wasn't as controversial. The main controversy here was that the bill allowed government to set an application fee for all your public records requests. We thought it was going to be in the realm of $25 based on what Minister Lisa Baer said. She made repeated mention in the House several times of a process to set this fee that would be happening in the future, where she would be listening to different groups who are upset about this, from First Nations leaders to academics to journalists to nonprofit groups, and would continue to engage with them before setting the fee. But it turns out that as soon as the government used its majority to push this bill through on the last day of the session last week, the minister went back to her office and in just a few hours signed the order setting the fee at $10 without any consultation plan or engagement plan or any of the things that she said in the House. And the opposition Liberals have accused her of misleading the legislature by spending days arguing she was going to do one thing and then doing the other thing. Maclean, what do you make of this bun fight here? And is there something bigger at play than just the fee and what the fee is and people's anger over that?
I mean, it is hard to see a case for this not being misleading the legislature. I mean, the timeline you laid out is pretty stark. Thursday afternoon, Minister Baer was saying, we are listening. We're going to continue to listen. Feedback's important. And then hours later, signing the order setting the fee at $10. There was no cabinet meeting in the interim. She made this decision either on her own in those hours, or the decision had been made at a cabinet level a few days or a few weeks beforehand. I believe the latter scenario is more likely, just knowing how the government functions. So whether or not you agree with fees being charged on FOIs, and I don't, the issue here is that the minister was consistently telling the legislature one thing when then manifestly and demonstrably doing exactly the opposite. If that isn't misleading the House, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. MLAs aren't allowed to lie or mislead the House, although, I mean, this day and age, they don't get thrown in jail or anything, even if they're found to have done it, and that would be hard to prove anyways. But Jillian, does any of this, we've talked in the past about how the legislature doesn't resonate with the public and governments don't need to be that concerned about it. So does that just feed into that, or is there any part of this that looks like a political risk to the government?
I think that, there's like a longer term political risk that the NDP starts to just sort of look hypocritical, that many of the things that they said when they were in opposition about the BC Liberals, they are now doing themselves. This was something that they used to accuse the Liberals of all the time when they were in government. And I think that it really shows as well how differently they are functioning as a majority compared to the minority when they are with the Greens, where something like this never would have happened. And I think that it raises a lot of questions for, is this the kind of mandate that really serves the public and the public interest if it continues to be a pattern in the next 3 years?
But the issue of FOI, we've talked about, it's hard to explain to the public. And then the issue of legislative governance and rules about misleading the House, and I'm not sure a lot of people are going to recognize how important it is, but it doesn't, especially in this era of COVID and floods and everything else going on. Is anyone going to care? I guess.
I think the issue will be more, not, you're right, it's not going to be specifically about FOI. It'll be, look, the government can move quickly when it wants to. We talked off the top of the show, we talked about a 5-day period of silence for the Fraser Valley Regional District in a time of crisis. 5 days, but hours into a promised, listening and consulting exercise, they set a fee. So, that to me is the more damning thing. It's not that the government is slow. It's that it's slow when it doesn't really care. And it's fast when it wants something for its own, it wants something on its own.
Yeah. And to Jillian's point about the larger narrative of how they're using their majority, to me, it kind of feeds into the pattern of, I think, deliberate misdirection on this bill. And I wrote down some of the different ways that this bill basically kind of misdirected people on what it was actually going to do. So I noted that the minister justified the fees by pointing back to several years of consultation where the fees were not mentioned. She cited a desire by health authorities and post-secondary institutions for the fees, but even UBC's Board of Governors said they didn't support it and they were never asked. She professed respect for the privacy commissioner, but then jammed him on this thing without telling him and taking his power away on the fees. She claimed robust First Nations consultation, but the Union of BC Indian Chiefs accused her of astounding arrogance and insensitivity on the fees because they're going to have to pay them. They would have to pay them for their records requests. They've actually been exempted, so I think she listened on that one. She argued deep respect for the legislature, but then shut out the all-party committee of MLAs that were supposed to review this act. And then she told the media she was recommending that fee of around $25. And then when we started using that figure, her office accused us of being so stupid that we'd got the wrong figure and why are we all so dumb? And we had to send the quotes of the minister back to her. So I think that pattern, especially in the news industry, when you put it together like that, you start to see kind of the structure of how the NDP introduces, defends, and justifies something. And that may become a pattern in future legislation. And if that's the pattern, that reminds me of the previous Liberal government quite a bit, and in the height of its arrogance. And so I'm not sure that, to your point, Jillian, is going to be great narrative for the government to start, laying down behind it on decisions like FOI that maybe they don't have to do that on. They don't need to do that to pass the bill. Appears to be a little bit of incompetence along the way. So that's my rant on FOI. Because we don't have Jillian, I get to rant. This is fantastic. I feel so free. So free. Let me take my tie off. Everything is great. Okay. But we ranted right until the end of the show. So sorry about that. Thank you both for being here. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back next week. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast feeds or on YouTube or on the Check Plus app. And we'll be back next week on Political Capital.